Thank you for joining me for the Talmud class today. Really appreciate it, as well as those who are joining us online on Facebook or on YouTube or podcast. Just really appreciate you joining us. Well, let's say the blessing over Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu
mitzvotav v'banu
Torah.
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 There you go. So it is so wonderful to be with you learning this sugya in the Talmud. We've been learning about in Shabbat, about the rabbinic power for making decrees. We're starting anew in June, and so I will summarize what we've been through. And really, I want to make these classes so you don't really have to go to every single class, that you can sort of know what's going on. Obviously, if you come to every class, things will be more easier for you, and you'll be able to know things deeper. But I think everyone will be able to join, which will be wonderful. We've been learning this wonderful passage in Tractate Shabbat that I'm personally learning through right now and really trying to understand, which really talks about the limits of rabbinic power and where rabbinic power comes from. And in terms of, in this particular sense, we're talking about laws, that whether laws come from a Torah origin or they come from a rabbinic origin, meaning they come from the power. So if they come from a Torah origin, laws come from the fact that they're commanded in the Torah, right? They're specifically and explicitly commanded within the Torah, at least within the rabbinic reading of the Torah, and then we call that deraito, or Torah mitzvah. It's obvious that the authority for those mitzvot and those laws and the requirement upon a person come from the authority of God and God's self, right? That God commands it, so therefore we do it. The authority from rabbinic mitzvot, or mitzvot that are not explicitly commanded within the Torah, but are rather suggested and decreed by the rabbis, are very different, right? God did not specifically say that we need to do these things, but rather gave the authority to rabbis in each generation to make decrees and laws, to create a fence around the Torah. Now, very important, rabbis can't abrogate Torah law, but they can add fences around, right, in order to protect the laws of the Torah. That is the general idea. And we've been talking about this idea that this really can go too far. Very easy that when rabbinic or administrative authorities are creating fences around laws, right, this can go way too far. That power can be abused very quickly. And so there's this real idea in our sugya that really rabbinic fences need to be tied to protecting actual Torah laws. And if it goes too far, the rabbis sort of don't have authority any longer to make laws. Now, we've gotten into really a disagreement between Rabbah and Abaye about specifically how far do these rabbinic laws go. One is, how far does the power of the rabbis go? Rabbah says that really the rabbis only have the power to make decrees over laws that protect a person directly from violating a Torah prohibition. Well, Abaye says you can actually make a fence, the rabbis can actually make a decree around their own decrees, right? So they can make a decree on a decree, or a gezerah al ha-gezerah. And obviously, Abaye believes in a more maximalist understanding of rabbinic power and their ability to derive and law beyond that of the Torah. Well, Rabbah seems to have a more conservative understanding of rabbinic power, where rabbinic decrees really have to be tied to directly addressing the possible violation of a Torah. Make sense so far? Wonderful. We were specifically looking at that. When this originally is brought up in the Mishnah that we were looking at, it was brought up specifically in the case of someone who goes out of their house before Shabbat with a needle, right? Or usually a tailor in this case, or somebody. Tailor goes out with a needle that they use to work. Obviously on Shabbat, according to the Torah, we can't carry outside of our Reshita Yechid, outside of our private territory into a public territory. This would be the breaking of a Torah prohibition. It's one of the 39 categories of forbidden labor on Shabbat. as detailed by the 7th chapter of Shabbat. Now, the decree that's made in the Mishnah is not that one can't walk out on Shabbat with a needle. Obviously, that is already legislation. So the rabbis don't need to say it because it already is true from the Torah. But what the Mishnah actually is saying is that even before Shabbat, even on Erev Shabbat, right, there is still a prohibition to carry out a needle. Why? Because as the Mishnah says, you might forget, right? You might forget that you have the needle on you, and then Shabbat happens, right? Shabbat comes in, and you just walk outside, not thinking you're doing anything wrong, and meanwhile you have the needle on, right? And you end up carrying on mistake. So the rabbis make a decree or make a gezerah, right, a fence around the Torah in order to prevent this from happening by saying, don't hold a needle before Shabbat. Don't go out with a needle upon you in this regard, right? And this is kind of the most simple interpretation. This is also Rashi's interpretation of the Mishnah. If you remember, for those who are here, the Tosafot, which are commentary written by Rashi's grandchildren, has a little bit of a different understanding of the sugya, which I think brings out some of the tensions that are at hand. The Tosafot noted that even on Shabbat itself, if you bring out a needle that's in your pocket or you carry something on mistake because you didn't realize it was on you, you'd be doing what's called unintentional labor. Unintentional labor. And according to the Torah, and according to the rabbis, the Torah prohibits in terms of Shabbat labor is intentional labor, right? So all it prohibits is you intentionally saying, I know it's Shabbat, but I don't care. I'm going to bring this out anyway, right? The Torah does not prohibit mistakes, right? Which probably wouldn't make sense anyway, because how can you prohibit a mistake, right? Mistakes happen, and you don't have free will over mistakes necessarily. And so therefore, the Tosafot basically says, this is only a rabbinic violation anyway, because the rabbis sort of go ahead and say, even unintentional sins, they put a decree around the Torah saying unintentional sins are also for unintentional breaking of the malacha, of the Shabbat prohibitions of work, is also a real problem, and is also a violation, but it's, again, a rabbinic fence around the Torah that's made. Now, the problem with this, is the Tosafot notes, is that then what you have is the Mishnah itself, which says that it's not even talking about during Shabbat, it's talking about before Shabbat, right, is a rabbinic fence itself. And so then what you have is a rabbinic fence around the rabbinic fence, right? The primary rabbinic fence is that you can't do an unintentional violation of Shabbat on Shabbat, right? That's the carrying out the needle on Shabbat a mistake, right? And then the second gezerah that is put around that in the Mishnah is specifically, not only can you not do this on Shabbat, but you can't do this before Shabbat because you might forget and might continue carrying it on Shabbat. So the Tosafot smartly notes that actually there's a problem here, according to Rabbah, which we get later in the sugya, which we talked about last time, is that rabbis cannot make a gezerah, and therefore for the rabbis, for the Tosafot cannot read the Mishnah this way. It seems to agree with Rabbah, and it makes a different creative answer to what the real problem was, which we don't really need to get into at this particular point in time for the sense of Chazarah, for the sense of review, to catch us up. And so that we basically said that. And then finally, as we were getting into the next Amud, going from 11a to 11b in the Talmud, when it begins speaking about this, specifically brings up a case which is in some ways seemingly a parallel case, right, of someone who specifically is, let me just make sure I get the wording correctly here, right? The one who is standing inside a private domain, right, inside their house or something like that, and then wants to drink water from a public domain, right? And the question is, right, can he do this? And if so, in what way can he do this, right? The problem is not the fact that you're consuming water in a public domain from a private domain, but the problem is that you might bring the water back, or a vessel holding the water back into the private domain from the public domain. And so the rabbis say you can only do this if you have your rosho and your mobo, right? Your head and the majority of your body in the domain, because then there's less of a danger of you taking this back into your area. And it begins to talk about this. And then there's a very funny phrase at the end that says specifically a Carmel about that you can't also do this. This rule applies also in terms of a wine press, right? That when you're around the wine press and you're pressing wine, you also need to have your rosho and your bow, your majority of your body and your head inside the area of the wine press in order to drink the wine as you're pressing it. Otherwise, there's a danger of you taking it, right? Now, this is very confusing because in the Mishnah itself, it seems very random, right? What does this have to? What does a wine press have to do with anything? And that's sort of where we last left off our heroes, kind of where we last left off our Gemara, is what do we do with this end of this passage that was quoted that in the Gemara, that this doesn't just have to do with drinking water from a private to a public domain, but it says v'chen beget, and so too in the wine press. So what does that mean? And Rabbah and Abaye, of course, are going to argue over what this particularly means. Without further ado, let's share the screen here so that you guys can all see the text as well. So, the Gemara says this, Ibayle, a dilemma was raised before the sages, right? Is this where I should start? Let me see if I should start a little bit before this. Right, okay. Okay. So the dilemma was raised before the sages. What is the legal status of a Carmelite in this matter? If you remember, we got into this last time. A Carmelite is a space in which is not a Reshut Yechid or a Reshut Rabim, but rather a middle territory. That is, this could be a public wildlife area, a street in which not a lot of people walk down. Things like this are considered a Carmelite. And this is not, the Torah only really has two domains, the Reshut Rabim and the Reshut Yechid, the private domain and the public domain. But the rabbis sort of add in this third middle area called the Carmelite, right? So that means that any laws having to apply with it are rabbinic laws in nature. They're not Torah laws because, well, the Torah doesn't prohibit anything with a Carmelite in this specific area. So that's why they ask, what is the legal status of a Carmelite in this matter, right? And of course, the matter they're talking about is when we're drinking water in one domain while standing in another domain, do we have to put our rosho and rovo, the majority of our body and our head, inside the other domain and in order to drink, or can we just stick our head in? Is that enough? Right? That's the question specifically at hand. Abaye said that case is equal to that case, meaning our case, right, is the issue of the Carmelite is the same, right? Because, right, so what Abaye seems to be saying is just as you can't drink water unless you put your rosho and your rovo into the public domain that you're drinking from, so there's less danger of you bringing the thing back into your private domain. So too would be the same law when it comes to, let's say you were standing in a private domain, but outside your house or outside the private domain where you're trying to drink this water is a Carmelite, a rabbinically prohibited domain, right? Then the law, according to Abaye, would be the same. Does that make sense so far?
Wow.
Any questions on this so far?
Yeah. So you mentioned we have private domain and public domain, and then the Torah applies only to the private domain?
Yeah. Yeah, so the Torah basically says there are two domains. You can't, and in terms of the malacha itself, in terms of the one of the av hamalacha, the prohibited labor from the Torah of transferring property from one domain to the other. The Torah really, at least according to the rabbis, the Torah understands there being really two domains, right? The private domain and the public domain. And when it's talking about this law, it specifically means that you can't bring in any physical object from the private domain to the physical domain to the public domain, or from the public domain to the private domain, right? And that's all the rabbis say. So if it's not, according to the Torah, if something's not an actual reshut rabim, which means, or a public area, which means there's a certain amount of people who need to be there and walking through, it needs to be a certain size and used for certain purposes, right? If it's not that, but it's also not a reshut yechid either, right? It's not a private space that's fenced in, that's above a certain amount from the ground. There's all these rules that I don't want to get into right now. right? Then it's neither of the above, and then the Torah would not prohibit it. So moving an object between a Reshut Rabim and a Carmelit, or from a Reshut Yechid, a private domain, into a Carmelit, you can make an argument that according to the Torah, right, there is no prohibition of it. It's the rabbis who go forward and say, all these other areas that are not Reshut Yechid or Reshut Rabim are considered either really, for, let's say in this matter, although it's more complicated, is considered a Carmelit, or this middle area, right? Which the Torah does not prohibit the transition of property from a private domain into a Carmelit, or from a public domain into a Carmelit. But what the rabbis did is they went forward and said, we're going to prohibit it. Now, why is that? Why did they create this fence? Because a random person might not know the difference between a public domain and a Carmelit, right? They might not know how many people necessarily walked in that area that day, or how large the street is. It's much easier just to say, well, you can't carry outside of your private domain, right? That's much more followable than really knowing the difference between a Reshut Rabim and a Carmelit. Scholars still argue about to this day, what is a Carmelit, what is a Reshut Rabim in our modern world. So obviously the fence is sort of necessary. Say you can't even take property into the Carmelit. Now, this is a case of rabbinic law, right? It's a rabbinic decree. Jerry, does that help?
Yes, that's very specific and very detailed. Thank you.
Yes, sorry. You have to think this way with the Gemara. It's a very intellectual text, and you really have to follow along with it. It's not, again, this no one is saying this is easy. It's like a language you learn slowly. So just follow along with me, and yeah, just let me know afterwards if I can make it better in some way, of course, or clearer. So regardless, Abaye says here they're equal, meaning you can't, just as you have to have your Rosho and your Ovo in a public domain in order to drink water or to drink there. So too with a Carmelit, you would have to have your full body and your head inside the Carmelit to drink the water. Right now, Rav has a problem with this. It seems like simple to Abaye, but Rav is going to have a problem. He says, what does he say? It itself is merely a rabbinic decree. And will we arise and issue one decree to prevent violation of another decree? So what is Rabba's problem? Does anyone guess? I don't know, Carrie or Liz, can you understand what Rabba's problem is here? Why does he disagree with Abaye? What's his hang up?
Not going to happen for me.
All right. Well, Rabba seems to say, right, that it is specifically, this is a rabbinic matter. The fact that you can't even carry in a Carmelit in the first place is a rabbinic decree, a protective fence that is built by the sages in order to protect from a person from the violation of a Torah law, right? Now, if we say, not only can you not carry between a Carmelit and a Reshut Yechid, right, between a private domain and a Carmelit, so too, you also have to make extra cautions so that you don't come to violate this on mistake, right? That you don't happen to bring the vessel or the water back from the Carmelit into the Reshut Yechid, right? If that is prohibited, which is, again, what Abaye is saying, the Mishnah is saying, right? Meaning it's the same as we treat in terms of the case of Reshut Yechid to Reshut Rabim, right? Then, according to Rava, the rabbis would be making a decree upon a decree, right? First rabbinic violation is carrying within a Carmelit, right? Is transferring property into Carmelit. The second rabbinic domain around that to prevent that from happening, right, is that when you're drinking in that area, you have to have your full body and full head inside to make sure that you don't bring anything past that domain. So do you see how it's a Gezerah on a Gezerah? It's a decree on a decree. It's a fence around the fence.
Yes.
Yeah, makes sense so far?
Yeah. Rabbi?
Yes.
Is the Carmelit a rabbinic decree? Would it considered a rabbinic decree too?
Yes, the Carmelit is a rabbinic. The idea and the creation of the idea of the Carmelit is a rabbinic concept, and the prohibition of transitioning or transferring an item from a public domain to a Carmelit or a private domain to a Carmelit is only prohibited in by rabbinic law, not by the Torah. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, so the Carmelite would be a rabbinic concept, but not a rabbinic decree because it's not prohibiting any type of action. Is that
Yeah,
how you would?
Carmelite is
Okay.
an area, right? Carmelite is an
Okay.
area that has certain rules in halacha that prescribe to, or in the conception of the rabbis. The prohibition is carrying into it, right?
Yes.
From another
Yes.
domain. That's the
Okay.
prohibition. You understand the difference?
Yes. Thank you.
Wonderful. All right, should we keep moving? Wonderful.
Sounds good.
All right, so we understand the disagreement between Abaye. It's not quite clearly stated for Abaye, right? Because Abaye seems to not have a problem with what Rava is saying, right? And he seems to think it's perfectly okay with creating a decree or a decree. Well, Rava obviously has a problem. So the next thing that the Gemara is really going to do is to try to understand why Abaye holds the way he does, and of course why Rava holds the way he does. So let's take a look. So the text says, and continues, Amar Abaye. Abaye said, Mana amenale. Sorry, go down a little bit so you can see the English. Amar Abaye, Mana amenale. It says in Aramaic, right? From where do I say that halacha? Meaning, from where have I learned this before? Right? How do I know that this is the case? Right? And he continues, Dikatane, from that which we learned in an earlier source at the end of the Mishnah, in which it says in Tractate Eruvin, where this source is originally quoted about having to stick your Rosho and Rovo in the Reshut Rabim before drinking, right? It says at the end of that Mishnah, when it's quoted in its place in Eruvin, right? It specifically says at the end, V'chen begat, right? And so too with a wine press. So if that be the case, the question arises, what is the status of the wine press in terms of the domains of Shabbat? If you say that it is the private domain, we already learned that in the Mishnah. If it is a public domain, we already learned that as well. Rather, isn't this press a Carmelite? Right? So what is he saying? Does anyone understand what he's saying here? What's the argument Abaye is making?
Yeah.
So what the argument that Abaye is making here, very importantly, right, is, well, the Mishnah already said you can't take from a Reshut Rabim into a Reshut Yachid, and you can't take from Reshut Yachid into a Reshut Rabim in the beginning of the Mishnah. Just to look back and show you what he's talking about, just to look back in the Mishnah, let's see if I can find it very quickly, right? You see in the Gemara where the Gemara is quoting, it immediately quotes the Mishnah in question here that Abaye is talking about. Lo yamod adam b'reshut yachid v'yishteh b'reshut harabim. Right, a person in a private domain should not drink water located in the public domain, and vice versa. In the public domain, drink water located in the private domain. So you see at the beginning of the Mishnah, that's the text of the Mishnah itself, right? It already verbatim prohibits transferring property from a private and a public domain, and specifically here in this case, right, the rabbinic fence around, making sure that not change water between the two, right? And at the end of this Mishnah, we specifically have this last word, and as is reported here by Abaye, he says, and the same is true in the wine press, right? So the Mishnah says at this Mishnah at the end, where it only quotes a little bit, at the end of the actual Mishnah, it says v'chein begat. Right, so if I was reading that back into the Mishnah itself, I'm just going to go back up here. Again, I'm just teaching how I read Gemara here. It's very important, right? So the way the Mishnah would read is Lo yamod adam b'reshut yachid v'yishteh b'reshut harabim. A person may not stand in the private domain and drink water in the public domain, or vice versa, stand in the public domain and drink water located in the private domain. However, he introduced his head and most of his body into the place where the water that he is drinking is located. There is no room for concern, and it is permitted. And as you see, as the Mishnah continues on, and the same is true in the wine press. So the question is, why does the Mishnah need to say, and the same is true in the wine press, right? Wouldn't it make more sense if the Mishnah just ended up in saying it is permitted? Because if you said it's the same with the wine press, and the wine press was either a Reshut Yechid or a Reshut Rabim, why would you have to specifically list the case of the wine press? Right? You would just you wouldn't need to list it. You would know that it's if it's a Reshut Yechid or a Reshut Rabim, then you follow the way that the Mishnah has already said. It doesn't need to say there's so many different Reshut Rabim and Reshut Yechid. It doesn't list all of them. Why the wine press? And so Abaye makes the supposition, therefore, that it must be a domain that is not either a Reshut Rabim or a Reshut Yechid. It is a Carmelite. Right? It's this middle territory. And so therefore for Abaye, the reason that the Mishnah lists this idea that the same is true in the wine press is because the Mishnah is trying to make a point about does this rabbinic decree apply on a rabbinic prohibition, which of course Abaye says, yes, it does. Make sense so far?
Wow.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. The Carmelite would be considered a rabbinic. Well, that I don't quite get, because I thought the Carmelite was not a rabbinic prohibition, but a rabbinic concept. So if it's saying that the wine press is in a Carmelite or a medium in between ground, how is that? Where do we get that there's a prohibition then, or a different prohibition?
Right, so the rabbis are the ones who decree and say this conceptual place called a Carmelite, which doesn't seem to be mentioned in the Torah, and is not the transfer of property into it is not considered a prohibition, right? And remember, I think it's very important, especially in the beginning, that we come back to this. The prohibition, the Shabbat prohibition, the Torah prohibition is transferring an object from one domain to the other, carrying an object from one domain to another. It's not standing in the area. It's taking one object that was in one area and moving it to another area on Shabbat, right? That's the Torah. The rabbi said there's this other area called the Carmelite that's kind of like an in-between area that the rabbis don't prohibit the taking from one domain, from a private or a public domain into it. The Torah doesn't prohibit it. But the rabbi said, created a fence around the Torah and said, you're also not allowed to do that as well, because there was a fear that if they allow them to do that, then they would fall into also carrying from a private domain to a public domain. So the rabbinic prohibition itself is the transfer of items from a public private domain to a Carmelite, not the domain itself.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Was the prohibition on the Carmelite, transferring in and out of the Carmelite, was that added later to the Mishnah in like Talmudic times, or like after, I mean, like, 500 to 700 CE, or was it original to the Mishnah in what was that, 100 to 200 CE?
At least according to the Talmud's perspective and according to the perspective of the rabbis in this text, it's part of the actual Mishnah itself. It was always part of the Mishnah, right? So that's why they have to deal with it in the first place, right? And the question is, why did the rabbis include that extra little part? Abaye, of course, is saying it's because that's an example of a Carmelite, and so that the Mishnah is detailing and saying, you also have this degree also applies to transferring property into a Carmelite, which of course, according to Rabbah, the problem with that is that it's a decree upon a decree, right? Which would be a problem for Rabbah, not for Abaye. Make sense?
Yes.
Wow.
Jerry, why are you saying wow? I'm curious.
Well, so we have these two guys, and sometimes they agree and sometimes they don't agree, but I get the major concept is we might forget what's going on, and because we might forget, we want to make sure we have this fence, if I'm saying it accurately.
Yes, 100%, 100%. So that's a general concept, right? But remember, we talked about in the beginning of this lesson, right? How far can you make these fences, right? For example, I don't want to die I really don't want to die in a plane crash, right? So, I'm going to take certain precautions to make sure I don't die in a plane crash, right? So some people say, okay, well, there's nothing wrong with riding in a plane, but I'm going to take certain safety precautions, right? I'm going to wear a seatbelt. I'm going to make sure that the plane is a safe plane and everything like that. Some people put those fences around in order to avoid losing their life in a plane crash, right? But some people feel the need to put more fences, right? Some people say, well, I'm not going to ride in an airport. I'm not going to go near an airport, right? I'm not going to go very far. I'm not going to travel there, right? They put more intensive fences around this thing, right? In order to prevent themselves from be more sure that they won't do this thing or they won't come into that situation, right? But it also, the more fences you put around something, the more it restricts your life, right? So that obviously is something we should be trying to avoid. You should do the least amount of decrees as possible, and only do the decree unless it really is protecting one from violating a Torah law. Does that make sense?
So we don't want unintended consequences. We want to tailor the law as not strictly, but as minimally, so we don't create more issues.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Makes sense so far?
Can I go back just to the wine press? So the
Sure.
wine press has been mentioned someplace else, was mentioned in the Mishnah. So I'm still not 100% with the wine press and where I'm standing when I'm drinking the water. Where is the wine press located?
Yeah, it's a good question. So think of a wine press. Let's say think of a wine press directly outside your house, right? It's not, I don't really know exactly what a wine press looks like or whatever. We could go into what a Talmudic wine press from 2,000 years looked like exactly, but it's not that important, right? So think of it as like a small machine that is located outside and it's outside your house, right? The moment you walk outside of your house, you're no longer in a Rishut Yachid. But the area specifically where the wine press is located, right, is land in which not thousands of 600,000 people are walking through, right? It's because there's a wine press there, right? It's a working place. It's not necessarily a place for public traffic, right? So therefore, the rabbi said that the wine press is an example of a region that we would designate as a Carmelite, right, or this in between area, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Okay, so
yeah.
yes.
I suppose the wine press was almost always located by the vineyards, which would be out, probably beyond the city, in the fields at least, wherever that would be.
Right. No, yeah, possibly. Yeah, but I think that's what's important is what is this wine press? Abaye seems to say it's a Carmelite, and that's why it's in the Mishnah. It is to show that the Mishnah is making a decree on a decree, which is proving, according to Abaye, that you can make a decree upon a decree, that there can be a rabbinic prohibition on a rabbinic prohibition, which of course Rava is going to disagree with. Make sense so far?
Yes.
Wonderful. Crystal clear?
Well, maybe.
Maybe. Well, that doesn't sound so crystal to me. Wonderful. All right. Let's continue on then. And again, if you have a specific question, please ask. I do want to explain. So this is what Abaye says, Rava says, we've gotten this so far. Let's keep moving then. So we've answered how Abaye derives his understanding of this from. How does Abaye understand that this comes to include a Carmelite as well, or transitioning and transferring an item between a public or private domain into a Carmelite, right? And so we've understood sort of how he derives this and how he understands this. We don't understand Rava. All Rava has really done so far is said, no, you can't do this. But how does he know therefore Rava now has to prove that the God isn't a Carmelite, or it's not intended to say that? So what is it intending to say? This gets a little more complicated in terms of the way Rava thinks about it. Rava said that which we learned in the Mishnah, and the same is true in the wine press, refers to the matter of the halachot of tithes, right? So What's maser in Hebrew, right? Tithing. Now, what is tithing? Tithing is a biblical commandment, meaning a Torah law, that you have to separate 10% of your crops and, depending on what tithe they're talking about, either give them to the poor, consume them in Jerusalem, or give it to the Levites, right? We're not really sure because it just says tithes. But regardless, you have to give that 10% first, and then you can drink your own wine that you made, just to make sure that you've given the tithe, right? Giving the tithe out of a food item actually is what makes it kosher, right? It's not really kosher until you actually make that tithe. Does that make sense so far?
That's nice. That's a nice rule.
Right? The food is
Yeah.
is actually prohibited from eating it until you tithe it. Okay? So Rob is saying, right, that what the reason the wine press is brought up or brought into the Mishnah is because it has to do with tithes. Now, it seems like a non sequitur. We don't really know, because, like, where does the Mishnah seem to be talking about tithes? That doesn't seem to have to do with the same topic, which is probably what makes this kind of a weird, kind of weak argument that Rob is making. The only difference is that Rava actually has proof from an earlier source that it is talking about Maser is the concern, not breaking Shabbat, but rather giving tithes. And how does he do that? It's based on, Rava says he heard it in the name of somebody else, someone older than him. It's, of course, Rav Sheshet. So it says, and Rav Sheshet also said, that which we learned in the Mishnah, and the same is true in the wine press, refers to the matter of tithes, as we learned in the Mishnah. One may, ab initio, drink grape juice directly on the press without tithing, whether the juice was diluted with hot water or whether the juice was diluted with cold water, and he is exempt. Okay, what is being said here? It's a little complicated, right? Right, he's saying that the wine press refers to the matter of tithes. How does it apply? Well, there's a specific ruling that when one is drinking wine, let's say you're working the wine press and you get a little wine, right? And can you drink it? It's almost a similar question to you're picking strawberries or apples. Can you just pick one off the tree and eat it, right? If you're just a worker, right? It's one thing if you have 100 of them. But can you just have an apple or a grape or something like that, where the owner is really not losing very much of their property to sell? Is there sort of a right to have a little bit of the food that you're picking or pressing and everything like that? And the idea in Judaism is that, yes, even before tithing or before anything, the person who is tilling the soil and taking can have a little bit of it. And they can even have a little bit of it before it gets tithed, right? The tithing only happens once the food is processed and taken back home. So there is an idea that you can drink the wine at the wine press before it actually becomes maser, or before maser or tithing is taken in a temporary basis, right? So that's what it says.
Yeah. Rabbi?
Yes.
Does that is that an extension of allowing your animals to eat the wheat that they're tilling or what harvesting or whatever? I can't remember the Torah rule, but is that an extension of it for humans?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think Torah considers animals and humans to be treated very differently. So I don't think it's an exactly parallel case, but I think it's similar in sentiment. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Wonderful. Right? So Rav Sheshet comes in and says that which we learn in the Mishnah, and the same is true in the wine press. He's talking about the Mishnah we're talking about. It refers to the matter of tithes, as we learned in the Mishnah. One may ab initio drink grape juice directly in the press without tithing, whether the juice was diluted with hot water or whether the cold juice was diluted with cold water, and he is exempt. Now, what is this thing with hot water and cold water? Well, the way they used to drink wine back then is that they used to actually, the wine was very, very heavy and very dense. And so what they would do is they would sort of dilute it with water, right? So the way that you would drink wine basically is you had this like really strong concoction of wine, of like full wine, and then you dump some water into it and mix it around so that it was watered down somewhat, and that made it drinkable. And that's the way people served wine back in the time of the rabbis. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes.
So there's a differentiation made here between when the water is hot versus when the water is cold, right? Because if the water's cold, right? Imagine you have a big jug of grape juice of grape juice. You take a slug of it before giving tithes, and you're like, okay, I had a little taste. I'm gonna give it back, right? I'm gonna put it back so I can sell it. So what you do then is you pour the grape juice out of the jug back into the pile, right, so that you can sell that grape juice. That's what we mean here by temper, right? You have a little taste of it, right? Once though that the water is hot and you make it hot, right, and you pour hot water into this taste, right, you might like it better than me, but the problem is when hot water is put into this whole entire vat of pure wine, it spoils the wine, right? It makes it so that you can't sell it. Because of that, right, then you have to be able to, you know, because of that specifically, you can't then you sort of ruin the crop itself. Once you put hot water into something like a big thing of grape juice, it sort of ruins the whole entire stock, and therefore you can't put the rest of your hot drink back. But if it's cold, you can put it back, right? And so the rule that is made here is to say that in terms of if it's cold water that you're mixing the grape juices, you can have it before taking a tithe, right, for a temporary basis. But if it's hot water you're putting in the grape juice, you cannot drink the grape juice until you fully tithe it away, and that's going to be very important. So that's specifically what Rav Sheshet says the Mishnah actually means when it says v'chen begat, right? Now, I think the question is, right, of course, what does this have to do with our sugya? So we're going to have to get to that in a second. And what does this have to do with carrying it in and out of a domain in general? But let's see how it ends. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Elazar, son of Rabbi Tzadok, obligates one to separate the tithe in both cases. So there's an understanding from Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Tzadok that whether the water is cold or hot, actually you have to separate the tithe. The rabbis, our rabbis, meaning the majority opinion, disagrees with this and says when the wine was diluted with hot water, he's obligated to tithe. However, when the wine was diluted with cold water, he is exempt because he returns the leftover wine to the press. Right? So we hear now that there's this disagreement in the Mishnah. There's disagreement in the understanding of the Mishnah over what is exactly the law in terms of tithing at a wine press, right? And there are some, specifically in this case, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yezer Tzadok, who say never, right? You can never drink it until you tithe it. The rabbis say you can drink it even before tithing it if it's cold, mixed with cold water, but not if it's mixed with hot water, right? And explains it. However, when the wine was diluted with cold water, is exempt because he returns left over to the press, right? So this is sort of where we're at right now, and how Rava is trying to prove what this is. Because if this wine get thing has to do with the prevention of not giving maaser, not giving tithes, then it doesn't have what to do with Shabbat, Gezerot, everything like that, and the Mishnah in particular, right? If it has something to do with something completely else, then you could say that Rabbah is still right. Rabbah is still trying to make himself right over Abai. Does this make sense so far?
Is the
Yeah.
Rabbi, is the issue that when the hot water and the juice mixture is carried to one location outside of the wine press, the original wine press, main stash, it ends up getting a different status. Like you don't have to tithe its status, but when it's back with the main stash, it you do have to tithe its status, or is it the other way around?
Yeah, I mean,
So that the status is changing depending upon where it's being carried. Is that what he's getting at?
in general, you're saying?
Because he's relating this wine press to the wine press and the tithing, that
Right.
when you bring that hot water wine one place or that cold water wine another place, there's a different status in regard to if you have to tithe it or not. So is he saying something like that, that if you're bringing water from one place to another, that it had, how does this is he questioning, like, how does this relate to our issue?
Yeah, I mean, he's got, and that's going to be something I think we'll figure out next time is like, how is this really related to, how are the cases related together? How is tithing, why would this case of tithing be in the Mishnah for Rav, and at least the way the Rav is understanding, and how does it relate to the case of Rosho and Rovo and making sure to put your head and body into a public domain when drinking water so as to make sure not to carry a water vessel or water back into a private domain on Shabbat? What does that have to do with tithing and this hot and cold water thing? That's going to be something we're going to have to figure out.
Okay.
All right. Well, I think we're good for this time. What we'll do is we'll start there next time. We'll try to start with that question is what do the two cases really have to do with each other? That's a really interesting conversation, and I'm sure we'll enjoy that as well. Sounds good, everybody?
Thank you so much.
Yes, thanks a lot. Thank you
Do
very
we
much.
do we enjoy this today? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Liz, I've never met you, but you're a very good student. So it's nice to have good students in my class.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah. Well, he's a good teacher. I appreciate being able to have this type of discussion, being a woman, and it wouldn't necessarily always get to have it, and I want to know how this thought process works, better. So thank
Me
you.
Yeah,
too.
you guys are really seeing the inside guts of Jewish law. This is how Jewish thought works. And this is, again, you might be noticing how complicated this is. I think this gives you a good view of like why rabbis have to train so much and have to learn so much. And this is very, very complicated. And hopefully it should give us respect for our sages of blessed memory who are experts at this. And, this is, but hopefully this adds a lot of respect for our tradition and the Jewish people in general, what our Torah is. It's really, really important. All right, until next time, we'll be here next Thursday is our next Talmud class at 10 a.m., everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.